Welcome to Retro Groove. Enjoy your voyage. Retro Groove. Retro Groove. Retro Groove. Retro
Howdy, and welcome to Retro Groove. I'm Adam.
And I'm Liam.
And this is a podcast where we talk about music that stands the test of time. Welcome to episode 9 of Retro Groove Season 2. Happy to have you here. Today we're continuing our little two-part series that we did one during our first season as well, entitled Expand Your Mind. Last episode, we expanded Liam's mind on the topic of Super Drag John Davis.
Yeah.
And this week, I'm going to school. I'm ready. So
Yeah. We're gonna talk a little jazz, which is admittedly like out of my depth ultimately too, because I mean jazz is such an expansive topic to begin with.
Oh yeah.
So we're going to dip our toes into smooth jazz.
Smooth jazz.
I feel like that's less challenging in some ways than some of the other stuff. It seems like a lesser mountain to climb, but we'll see.
Yeah. And hopefully we'll remove maybe some of the social stigma.
Yeah. I want to poke at it. Yeah, let's talk about it. Yeah.
But before we do that, Liam, how's it going?
Going pretty good. We're getting into the holiday season.
Yeah. Fat boy fall.
That's holiday music is on the radio, and I'm not that mad about it. It's okay. I'm starting to hear it.
It's okay now. We're into November. It's fine.
We're cool. And things are a little quieter in some areas. I think people are laying back a little bit, and it's kind of nice.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah, I mean, same. We put the Christmas tree up yesterday.
No.
Yeah. Is it too early?
Is it a real tree? And it's not a real tree.
No.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
No, not a real tree.
I would love to put up because we do a real tree, and I'd love to put it up before Thanksgiving, but it's dead by December 15th.
Oh, no, you can't do that. No, if you do the real tree thing, you have to do
you gotta wait. Yeah.
No earlier than the first week of December.
Yeah. We go a couple days after Thanksgiving, and even then it's like this Christmas morning it's looking a little haggard.
Yeah. And we've done that in the past, but my place now is so small. We just have like a small artificial, and
nice.
So the tree, it took 5 minutes to put it up. It's that small.
Yeah.
And put some lights up on the porch, and we're set. We're good to go.
I love that. I saw an ad for like this collapsible tree, and I was just like,
oh my God.
That seems convenient. Like this person like just flips it over, pulls it up, and it pops out, and it looked really nice. And I'm like, that could be great. Don't have to sweep it up. Don't have to worry about my cats. Like I don't know. I could become an artificial tree guy in the coming years. We'll see.
It's like anything else. You lose the best thing about it is the aroma.
The smell,
just having that pine, like the actual natural tree aroma in the house when it's fresh and it smells good. There's nothing like it. There's no way to replicate that. Doesn't matter how many Bath and Body Works wallflowers you get. It doesn't come anywhere close.
Yeah, I got a can of aspen fir something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Doesn't cut it at all. And I remember there was one Christmas as a kid when we lived out in Arizona that we did the National Lampoon thing where we drove out to a place where you like pay a fee and you cut down your own Christmas tree.
Wow.
So
Real
I've-
rustic.
Yeah, and I've had that, and we've had the Costco tree, and we've had everywhere in between. So
All right. All right.
I'm not a stickler either way. A lot of people are Christmas tree purists. I'm
Right.
like, hey, you got something. You're in the Christmas spirit. It's good enough for me.
Right. But the Christmas records aren't going on the turntable yet.
We did put on some Christmas music in the car yesterday.
Wow. All
on
right. Go
purpose.
for it. Yeah.
So we had it's usually the classics. We had Jingle Bell Rock and a little bit of Charlie Brown Christmas soundtrack album. So
Great.
we're getting there. We're easing
Okay.
in.
All right. Like it.
We're easing in.
Great.
It's been a rough year. So
Yeah, look.
we're kind of ready to dig into the good stuff a little bit early this year.
Yeah,
For
no, I'm
sure.
into it. I'm into it. Like I usually throw music on while we're trimming the tree, and I've felt this kind of draw to be like, well, maybe like while I'm cooking dinner, I can throw a record on, And I feel like next
Definitely.
week. I feel like next week it's gonna happen. Yeah.
Yeah, it's usually closer to Thanksgiving, but this year it just kind of it felt
Feels right,
right
feels
to
right.
do it this weekend,
Yeah.
and I can't, I can't complain. It's good. It's been great.
Have you purchased anything lately? Has there been anything that you had your eye on? Is there a Christmas thing that is something on your Christmas list for albums or records?
There's a few, and I put a little bit out there in the Discord about it, but I'm not mad at the number of represses that are floating around right now.
Yeah.
They're one formative, important band to me is Mogwai, and they're repressing their first two albums, Young Team and Come On Die Young. And those are albums that had a vinyl release when they came out and were never pressed again. So those are the types of albums that if you go on Discogs like right now, they're triple digit prices for those.
Jeez. Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
we're
Okay.
talking, you're going to pay $100, $150, $200 for these records.
Wow.
So it's great to finally see albums like that repressed. So I can, and they come out, I think, early next year. So definitely happy to see that. They did a new pressing of the first Rival Schools album, United by Fate.
Right.
That I'm a big fan of theirs, and that was also a really important album for me back then, 20 something years ago when it came out. So it's just great. It's great to see these albums that have gotten on the expensive side because they haven't had a pressing in so long
Yeah.
to get repressed. And so, coming off of the Super Drag episode, just crossing my fingers that we get a repress of their first album and maybe finally get a pressing of Last Call for Vitriol. So that's my
Right.
Christmas wish.
All right.
This year is the 20th anniversary of Last
Yeah.
Call for Vitriol, and we still have a month and a half of the year left for them to announce something. So I'm
Yeah.
still holding out a fool's hope that
Well-
we might see something.
Well, so we know that, and if he's still listening and tuning in, then, hey, thanks for checking us out again.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, but like you got a note after our last episode went up, right?
I got a really interesting private message after our Super Drag episode. So if you didn't tune in for episode 8, you should go back and listen to it because this episode is the second part to that.
Yeah.
But I expanded Liam's mind on the topic of Super Drag, John Davis, and the Lees of Memory. And not too long, maybe a couple hours after the episode went live, I got actually, you know what? Not from when it went live, but from when it was like tweeted out
Okay.
and I tagged the Leaves of Memory and Superdrag on Twitter.
Right.
So a couple hours after I tagged Leaves of Memory and Superdrag, I got a direct message from the Leaves of Memory account, which is run by John Davis and Brandon Fisher of Superdrag. And it said, "Hey man, John here." So I stop and I'm like, hold on, wait, there's no way. I've been listening to this dude's albums for 25 years. Like, what is going on right now?
So fun.
Hey man, John here. Thank you for all the kind words and for taking the time to promote us. Just wanted to let you know you missed our first album. It's called He was cool about it. It's called Sisyphus Says. It came out on Side One Dummy in 2014. It's on Spotify, Apple Music, etc. I think you might like it. Peace sign emoji.
Dope.
And I was like,
that's so fun.
There's no way. And then after I read it, I realized, hold on. He's saying that I missed his first album.
Was
the
it
first
not in
Leaves
the
of
playlist?
Memory album?
Yeah.
And he's right. And I didn't talk about it. But then I was like, wait, that means he listened to the episode.
Potentially. The only other thing is you do a companion playlist for stuff, but you don't usually post that like there, right? So it's not like he looked at the companion playlist and saw there was nothing on there.
I did post a playlist.
Yeah.
But I mean, so I guess that's possible, but like you can't fit everything on the playlist.
No, there's a good chance that he was listening. So he might be listening now,
He said for all the kind words and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, the implication
Either
is
way.
that he listened. Yeah. Yeah.
He took the time out. And so I made right on somehow, and he's totally right. I missed it. I don't know why I never even really noticed its existence. But their first album from 2014 is very different. It's very, very shoegaze. Sounds a lot like My Bloody Valentine, that type of wall of sound shoegaze music, and it's really, really good. And I was
gonna say that's also your jam. So
it is, and I'm like angry with myself for not knowing about it. And it's funny, like he was really nice, he was really cool about it, but it's like, I got called out by one of my heroes for forgetting that one of their albums exists.
He was just making sure you didn't
He
miss
was cool.
it. Yeah, he
literally was like, I think you might like it, and I was like,
here's how you can listen. Check it out. Like, that was a cool note, man. Yeah, that was great.
So
very
thank you,
exciting.
John, for reaching out. You're listening again. But
and John, my mind is currently in the process of being expanded. I mean, like
There we go.
listened to Head Trip a bunch. That's definitely my album at the moment. But
heck yeah.
I feel like I could be a Valley of Dying Stars fan in the not so distant future. Like, I've gone over and I've listened to some songs over there. I see where it went. I'm digging it. I feel like I need to get a little more, like I need to bond with the singers and I need to bond with the music for things to really stick for me. I've got this weird thing of needing to like personally get interwoven and feel a connection to stuff. And I feel like it's developing. It's like I got it. It's in the process.
I feel like going into winter is a good time to get into that album.
Yeah, I could see that. I just can't shake this feeling like it's so crazy that I missed it. You know, like it like the timelines just didn't line up for me to be a fan of this band, and it's so weird because I'm a fan of every other band that is in the orbit or came immediately after this band. So
yeah, exactly. And I mean, they technically have a release on Vagrant too.
Yeah,
which was your only.
That was
your only like window into the Superdrag world. So.
That's right. Yeah.
But today,
Well, yeah. I mean, if you want to talk about leaving out albums, I mean, it's going to be an even broader conversation than just one artist. But the artist that I'm kind of building this conversation around has put out over 60 albums and is still releasing music. So,
Yeah.
Bob James, if you're listening, I'm going to apologize in advance because
You're
I'm
gonna
not
miss something.
I'm not
just with
getting
the
to
time
everything.
constraints.
It's just not going to happen tonight, Bob. But I love you, and yeah. So I'd like to talk a bit about jazz, smooth jazz specifically, and within that, I want to talk about my association with it, my connection to it, which is therefore Bob James. But then, I mean, there's so many artists in that space that I then have been exposed to. I mean, like Grover Washington Jr. and Earl Klugh specifically are just like two fantastic artists that, like, again, Bob was my gateway drug, so I'm anchoring it around him. But it's not to say that one is more pronounced than the other. Like,
Right.
It's almost a conversation about a genre and a collection of work beyond just one.
Yeah.
But yeah, so don't turn the podcast off. Like, this isn't the Weather Channel, as Adam said. Like, like we're not stepping into an elevator or a doctor's office here. Like, we can talk about smooth jazz, and it's going to be okay. I
Yeah,
promise.
of
Like,
course.
it's going to be cool. Yeah, it's so. I don't know what your history is with jazz, just in general. But you know, I was, as we've well established at this point, I was the pop, rock, emo, hip hop kid in school, like most kids were. I played in like the orchestra and whatnot, and you know, so I knew what I knew, but it wasn't anything. I didn't listen to a lot of classical. I didn't listen to jazz. I didn't have any real jazz friends. And then you do a thing where you go to college, right?
Yep.
And
Yes.
and you meet a bunch of weirdos.
That's exactly when it happens.
Yeah. Were you aware of jazz at all before? Like in pre-college school life? Like, did you
I mean, I was
listen to
certainly
anything
aware
like that?
of it. So,
Right.
I mean, this is gonna sound funny probably, but I feel like my first introduction to jazz music was probably from the Aristocats, the Disney movie cartoon.
Yeah.
Because there's, that's a very jazz themed soundtrack.
Yeah.
And so that was probably like my first introduction to that sound.
Yeah.
And I loved it, but didn't know, where to go with that. And then, fast forward, my dad and uncle were both very into a lot of kind of jazz or jazz adjacent music. My like stuff like Chuck Mangione,
Yeah.
Chicago.
The big bandy. Oh, okay, cool. Yeah.
So like that stuff was in my dad's record collection. So once I started, going through his abandoned pile of records in the garage when I was, probably 15, 16, I started to hear some of that kind of stuff. But I didn't get into, bunny ears, quote unquote, real jazz
Right.
until, coming out of college, working at a record store and
Yeah.
hearing things like Miles Davis and Dizzy
Coltrane
Gillespie,
and right.
Coltrane, Thelonious Monk, and hearing all of that for the first time.
Right.
It's, for a music fan, unless it just really doesn't click with you for some reason, it's usually a revelation.
Yeah.
And you either at that point, go through your jazz phase, or or become just a lifelong jazz freak.
Yeah.
And I still very, very much appreciate it.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say it's all that often that I, hop in the car and throw on a jazz record.
Right. Like you may not have that personal bond with it. I admittedly, for the most part, don't have that personal bond with it where I'm listening to it on demand. For me, it's almost a situational thing. If I'm out and there's live jazz at a thing, that's cool. You
Yeah.
know, like
Live jazz is
I'll go
great.
see live jazz and have a drink and have something to eat and just experience the moment. Like that's really awesome.
Yeah.
I feel like so I was fortunate my freshman year. I'm dormed up with this kid who's a vibraphone player, and he's going.
Wow.
He's going to school, like not an instrument that you can just cart around. Vibraphone,
Right.
for anybody who isn't aware, is just like this huge table that looks like a giant xylophone, basically, if you're familiar with what that is. And he's holding little mallets in his hand, and he's playing chords and stuff on these like wood blocks with tubes sticking out of them. It's amazing.
Yeah, they've
He
got
didn't-
pipes that come down.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh yeah, they're
And then
intense.
You plug it in, and
Yeah.
there's like some rotating mechanism that gives it that like kind of vibrato sound.
Exactly.
A
Yeah.
very
So-
unique sounding instrument.
Yeah,
Yes.
so he didn't have that in the dorm room, which is kind of a bummer, to be honest with you. But like, also, I don't know where we would have put it. We were living in a hole in the wall.
Yeah.
But so he had a record player, which I was like, cool. I've seen this before. I don't know what's up. And outside of like a handful of Beatles albums that I was familiar with that he had and we would listen to, he was a jazz head. He was going to school for jazz. And so he put me on to, he had a bunch of Billie Holiday and Lester Young, and that whole like Count Basie scene was really
Billie
his
Holiday is
vibe.
the gateway drug.
Yeah, so Billie, I mean, like that
Amazing.
feeling when you first hear Billie Holiday, because I
Yeah.
don't think I ever had before, right? And so, like, he puts on, like, I'm just laying there. I promise I wasn't really imbibing in too much of anything, but like just laying there listening to Billie Holiday and losing my mind because I have like never heard anything like this before. And his favorite artist was Lester Young, Prez, who like was her counterpart for years in those early days. And just great sax player. He had a friend who came over who was a big Herbie Hancock fan, and so I got put onto some funky Herbie albums.
Oh, wow.
But like there was always this kind of barrier to entry for me. Like even having people who were there, they were jazz majors. I was not, like I like for as much as I could sit there and appreciate it, like these guys were 10 miles down the road and were just like waving to me in the distance still,
Yeah.
But then, so I started, I was broke just like any college student. But he let me use his turntable. Like, he and I lived together for most of college. And so by the second or third year, we get an apartment and I'm digging around just in bargain bins in record stores in Manhattan. And I'm coming across these like jazz LPs and stuff where I'm like, oh, this could be fun or whatever. And I had noted that the theme song to Taxi was, I love Taxi. I grew up watching Taxi with my parents. That was their favorite show. I think it's one of the funniest shows. The ensemble of that TV show, by the way, is just insane. Danny DeVito, Tony Danza, Christopher Lloyd, Andy Kaufman. It's crazy to look back on who was in that show. But so not only just the theme song, but then I would find out that all of the music from all of Taxi is done by this one guy. He created all the music for this. And so I grabbed one of his albums because I love Taxi. And I'm like, okay, it's $3 and I'll take this home and whatever. And I pop it on and it's immediately accessible, not just because I know the song. It's like hearing a song from your past and it's it's like 6 minutes long, so it's not just the 30-second clip in the beginning of the show.
Right.
But it feels like the show to me. And I'm like, man, this is like scratching a weird kind of itch. And then another weird side thing is like, so then I start, we have the internet at that point, and I'm Googling around, and I like watching this guy, and he's got perfect pitch, and he's like this amazingly fluent pianist. But I'm like, he reminds me of my grandpa, who like couldn't read music. He never learned to read music, but he had a piano, and he would just sit there, and he'd play standards, and he'd play jazzy kind of stuff or whatever, but he would just like, I just watch him just riff. The guy would just go, and like couldn't write out a song for you if he tried, but like just taught himself what it sounded like and how to make it sound good to himself. And so I'm having this moment of like, okay, now I kind of know jazz, and I kind of know like what this music like that I like in this TV show, and like I miss my grandpa, and like all of this kind of comes together into this moment of like, oh sweet, like now I have something here, like all of a sudden I have this like personal entry point into jazz. I mean, like after that, finding out that is technically smooth jazz and is not necessarily like the coolest jazz to be into, whatever, not a big deal. I was aware of Kenny G and how he was like the Nickelback of jazz, but also Kenny G's ridiculously talented, so whatever. Like they just threw a lot of reverb on him, and he played some love songs. Like,
there you go.
What are you gonna do? Nickelback sold a lot of albums, and so did Kenny G. Like smooth jazz was so big that it took over terrestrial radio and then like burned itself to the ground, basically. And again,
the oversaturation killed it.
Yeah, and it permeated into everything else, and it was over commodified, and we can get into that whole thing. But anyway, just personal trajectory, just to kind of round this out. So I'm starting to dig around, and there's a lot. And that's the thing is like, I'm not even like, I don't have a shopping list at this point. Like I'm just digging through jazz, like the jazz section at these record stores, and I'm coming across $3, $4, $5 albums that I've never seen as I'm going month after month by Bob James, and like I can't even fathom how much this guy has put out, or like, and then I'm finding them where he did an album with this other guy, and then like there's this other collab thing and whatever. And then I find out that he forms like a super group in the 90s and like puts out 12 albums with this super group of like these amazing players. There's just so much there. But from there, I get exposed to David Sanborn and Grover Washington Jr. and some of these others, and I start picking up their albums. And then I listen to some of those, and I hear like that iconic Rhodes sound and play style, and I'm like, that's freaking Bob James. He's on this album here.
And you can recognize that it's him.
Yeah.
That's
and
dope.
it kind of clicked to me. So it was it's this album called Mr. Magic by Grover Washington Jr. It's so good. And I remember listening to it and realizing that that's Bob James. He's not on the cover. And this is like, again, this is stupid me brain back in the day where I'm like, it should say it. But like, you look inside and it obviously says it. But, it's not billed as Grover Washington Jr. with Bob James. It's a Grover Washington Jr. album.
Right. That he plays on.
Yeah, and there was this thing that seems so dumb in hindsight, but at the time, the jazz nerds who were coming to hang with my roommate, and then I guess by default had to spend time with me, would talk about like who's playing on what, and I'm like, why do you care? What do you like? Like, no, like, do you really care? Because it wasn't just like, oh, did Dave Grohl play drums on the Tenacious D album? That's cool. Like, that's where I was at. You know, I was like, oh my God, that's kind of crazy. This was a
Right.
different kind of thing. This is like, oh no, like Roy Carter played on this, and then he went and did that, and then like, you know, Harvey Mason did that. Like, I'm like, what? It sounded like when people talk about baseball or football and people getting traded, and I was just like, how are you guys keeping track of any of this, and
how do you
why
retain all of this?
well, yeah. I mean, it's like Pokemon or whatever. Like, I'm just like, I do not have the encyclopedic capacity to understand any of this. But
Exactly right.
then when I heard that, I'm like, oh, I can see why you care, you know? Because like, I'm a Bob James fan, and now I've bought this album, and I have, on top of the fact that it's this great album by this artist, but now I have a new Bob James album, basically, because he's on this thing. So that kind of clicked. So he gets into the 90s. So I follow his trajectory. I mean, this is mid 2000s that I'm having my discovery, and I'm going back, and then I find out that he's in this band where he creates this band called Foreplay. I pick up, they mainly put out CDs. I didn't find vinyl at that point. I was just buying CDs. And again, it was like 99-cent CDs.
Right.
Because they'd been out since 92, 93 at that point. And to be honest, like the Foreplay stuff, I didn't give it as much attention. I haven't gone back to it as much. I probably will someday. But there's just something about his early work that, and what it's almost the preface to what we call smooth jazz, but in essence it is what it is, and it just kind of gets commodified as what we define it, and that's kind of why I want to talk about it, because smooth jazz is also funk jazz and R&B jazz and soul jazz. It's all this different stuff.
Right. And nobody knocks that stuff.
Yeah, but like when it gets kind of, like I said, when it gets washed in reverb and done just by some random guy to throw on a TV network, like that's kind of a bummer. But at the same time, there's a reason why it works. Like there's a reason why you don't roll your eyes when it's on there, and there's a reason why when you hear hold music, you're like, this kind of slaps, you know, like there's times when that happens. So I'd like to dive in a little bit to like what frames it for me, and then just talk a little bit about how I view the sort of genre as a whole. Does that seem cool to you? I know I'm expanding your mind here, but I'm just doing all the talking. So
No. This is great. Like, you know, this is one of those things. This is not at all like the Doors Expand My Mind episode that we did last year, where I came out of the gate as someone who was actively
despised.
Opposed to the. I mean, that might be a little bit strong, but I was not.
It was eye rolls. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't like it, and and maybe it was because I didn't get it, and it was almost certainly partially because I didn't understand. The backstory behind the band and what Jim Morrison was doing.
Right.
So this is not like that at all. This is more. Okay, yeah, like I watched Taxi and I liked the music for that TV show.
Right.
But other than that, I just
you didn't follow the white rabbit down the hole. Yeah.
Right. This is just something that I'm discovering because of this episode.
Right.
And so that feels a little bit better because it feels like a discovery more than like you trying to convert me to another religion. Like,
right.
So,
well, and one thing, and I've already said it once or twice, I'm sure I'll come back to it again. But one thing that I do find interesting about this whole kind of subset of music is that it's there is the barrier of entry to jazz where it's just like, do I get a Sonny Rollins thing? Do I start with Dave Brubeck? Do I just go to Miles Davis? How do I know if what's cool?
Yeah, it's hard to know where to start.
Like, it's so hard, man. I do feel like, as an aside, you can just pick up a Herbie Hancock album and go. Like, don't feel stressed about it. Just go. But I know I can only operate off of what I know. And what I know is when I walk into a record store and I start digging around, I'm overwhelmed. And I know a decent amount about music, but when I dig through stacks, I'm like, I don't know what I'm looking for.
Exactly.
Like, I don't know what half of this stuff
rough.
is.
I got to pull out my like wish list. Even just to get an idea of what I'm looking for. So I understand.
And it's also, it's like hard to find stuff. And like, if you're looking for a specific thing, it seems to be the thing that you never really find. And it can get really expensive. And my point is, my point before going on any further is like, this is a subset of music that, if you're dealing especially with like the 70s into the 80s of this sort of preface to smooth jazz and what becomes smooth jazz before it hits the Kenny G Titanic sinking moment, like you can't really miss, like, whether it's a George Benson album or an Earl Klugh album, whatever, like, you're gonna find these things. They're gonna be $4 or $5 and you will not regret it. Like, it is just an easy buy as you're digging through stacks to be like, oh, I don't know what this is. Each of these artists has put out dozens of albums, and they're out there, and they are not expensive. They're very easy to just throw on and appreciate. So, so that's just like, as the aspiring record collector who's listening, or the person who listens to one type of music but maybe doesn't go into another or whatever. Like, this is a safe space as always, and if you're in your record store, like, that's actually a safe space to kind of go digging, and you don't have to worry about it too much. You know, like, you're going to pull out some kind of gold there, and it's not going to break the bank.
Yeah.
So Bob James, it's a kid coming up, perfect pitch. He's playing a lot of avant-garde jazz. He's got a group that he enters the Notre Dame Jazz Fest, just to mess around, you know, like, they go there just to kind of break the mold a little bit and play around and gig around. And one of the judges of the competition at the Jazz Fest is Quincy Jones. And Quincy Jones recognizes what's happening on stage. Bob and his crew win the competition at the festival. This is in early 60s, 62, 63, something like that. And Quincy says, you're going to put out a record on Mercury. Come, like, you and me. Let's go. Like, you got talent. I see it. Let's go. And he does. He puts out an album, mainly covers some of his original stuff. It's not an album that I actually listened to a whole bunch. It was a little more in that sort of avant-garde, free jazz space. And then after that, he spends the 60s kind of honing in with session work and arrangement. He jumps on for the ride. Quincy and this guy, Creed Taylor, who runs this record label, they start tapping him for all of these gigs, kind of featuring and performing. And so through the 60s and into the early 70s, that's his main gig. He's figuring out how to be expressive within other people's works and other people's visions. And it kind of tightens him up, I think, a little bit. And so he does all that collab work, and he goes and he puts out this album, his first solo album post that Mercury release. And he calls it One. And he goes through to release 2 and 3 and 4. And then he releases Heads, which is a nickel, which is 5. And then he releases Touchdown, which is 6, and he starts playing off of the numbers a little bit.
And 3 was the one that it was overwhelming because I tried to. I didn't want to come in
a lot.
completely blind, so I, looked through the catalog and I was like, well, I need to find something to listen to, but there's just so much there, and so I ended up kind of randomly slash not randomly picking.
It's got the prism on it, right?
There it is. And that had to have been what it was. It just kind of harkens back to Dark Side of the Moon.
Yeah, it looked like it.
With the prism and the spectrum of light that emanates from the prism. And I started listening to that in the car, and I was like, "Oh, dang! Like this is good."
It's funky, yeah, it's funky. And so he goes off and he just starts releasing these solo albums. The first one was supposed to just be like an experiment, but it does pretty well. And so he continues to go on and release those, and then Taxi happens. So, 1978. Is when his 6th album comes out. That's the one that features the theme song. He then kind of gets signed on to do all the music for the show. He releases a thing, and this is another tricky part about a body of work like this, and B, how complicated this stuff gets legally, is you can't stream a lot of this music now. So like you can find 3, like he owns 3. And he starts putting stuff out on his own label. I think in 77, he creates something called Tappan Zee Records, and he still puts things out to this day on that label. But so he puts out this album called The Genie, which is like variations of the songs that he wrote for Taxi, but you can't find it anywhere. Like it's like you can if you're lucky in a record store, I mean you can find it on Discogs like anything else, but it's just like you can't stream that. You probably can find easily streaming his recent stuff and then a bunch of collective things from the past, but you can't really get a comprehensive body of his work or a bunch of these other artists' work from that time just because of licensing mess from back in the day.
Right.
So he puts out this really cool like series of funk influenced kind of soul R&B influenced jazz albums, but they're tight, they're concise. He's got this style, that Rhodes sound that just like it feels like there's some momentum to it constantly. It's not like what you would think of smooth jazz where you're like walking on a beach or you're just like lounging in a chair and sipping some kind of beverage. Like he can go there, but some of the stuff is Celtic influenced and some of the stuff is Latin influenced, and he's kind of all over the place, but it never...
Yeah, there's some life there for sure.
Yeah, but it never feels so like out there. So I kind of counter it to Herbie in his like Headhunter Thrust era, which is the same thing in the middle of the 70s. These guys are concurrently putting out these albums, and like Bob is over here releasing these like kind of tight focused but still very like expressionistic, and there's a lot of virtuosity there. It's just not as... It doesn't demand your attention as much, I guess. Like it like you can kind of like ride it a little bit easier for me than Herbie Hancock. But like Herbie's Headhunters album has the same drummer that then goes on to play in Foreplay, like and play and performs on a bunch of Bob's albums. So like the rhythm section is all the same. They share rhythm sections often, but two very different things. Like I can't listen to Herbie Hancock and do work, but I can put on a Bob James
cerebral
album and just go. Exactly. That's exactly what it is. So he gets some kind of like pocket fame as an arranger and a producer and obviously a performer and composer for all the work he does on Taxi. And we've talked hip hop a bunch on this, but I don't know how familiar you are with Bob James's overlap with hip hop. Or
Well,
if
again,
you
only what you've mentioned. Like
Right,
I had,
right.
I have no knowledge of this dude
Right.
outside of the things that you've said, both in passing and leading up to
Okay.
this.
So like he gets cued in the late 80s that there's these kids, the Fresh Prince and DJ Jazzy Jeff, and they have basically taken one of his songs and rapped over it. And he's like, "Wow, that's cool.
Yeah.
Did they pay me?" And they're like, "Nah." And so he sues them, like, and you could read interviews about it. Like he's apologetic in some senses where he's just like, I wasn't trying to be a jerk, but like I needed to protect my copyright. Like that's
Well, of
my
course.
music.
Yeah.
They just took my music, and he didn't rake him over the coals. He's like, yeah, we settled. Like we came to a nice settlement. But he becomes aware of the fact that before that happens in 88, for the years before that, his albums have been getting pulled out of the stacks, just like I am them pulling them in the early 2000s, but for very different reasons. That there were all these kids who were buying these albums in the 80s, and they were like asking for him by name at these record stores all around the city, and to the point where like the record store owners were like, "Why are all these black kids asking for Bob James records? Like, what is happening here?"
They realized that the potential in those albums for use in as DJ material.
Exactly. So someone had gotten hip to, again, his rhythm section, which was tight at that time. Those first couple albums were like very tight, but like had some real groove to them. Just like tight, infectious groove. With his key playing, it's just like simple 3-piece kind of thing going on here. And there's a handful of songs that he has across those first 4 or 5 albums that are some of the most sampled songs in all of hip hop history.
Wow.
Like everything, like he winds up inadvertently being one of the foundational building blocks in what then is what like hip hop emerges out of, specifically in New York. Now he is, again, like his label's called Tappan Zee, which is a bridge here. He is wholly, there's a very New York vibe to what he does in his music. Again, he's international, he's collaborated with everybody, but there's something that is at its core is a very New York vibe. So it's kind of unsurprising to me to begin with. But these artists are looking for breaks. They're looking for instrumental breaks that they can get 2 copies of, and they can quickly have, like, the DJ would switch back and forth and resync the break. So you get a certain clip of Nautilus, which was the last song on his first album, and the guy has 2 of those LPs, and so he's like, he hits the clip on the left turntable, he syncs it up on the right one, and he throws it over, and you just keep replaying that same instrumental, and you make a beat live.
Right.
And that's what these kids are doing in the clubs. Like they are listening to, like we said, they're listening to what they heard on the radio. They're learning how to kind of express themselves through freestyle poetry, lyricism over these sampled beats, but they're not making their own. They're grabbing Bob James's albums and they're spitting over his funky freshness, you know?
Yeah.
And so, dude, we're talking, I mean, it's everybody. It's Jay-Z, Nas, Ghostface Killah, Tribe Called Quest, Slick Rick, Missy Elliott. Like, everybody has performed at one time or another in that era, from the 80s even to today, but really the 80s to the early 2000s. If there's a rapper that you like, there's a good chance that there's a song that they did that had a Bob James sample in it. It's like it's
bonkers.
crazy. He's one of the most sampled artists of all time. Hundreds and hundreds of samples.
Wow.
And side note, like, because they're all from the first couple solo albums that he did, he owns all of that. And so he's looking back on this, like, once hip hop gets quote unquote legitimized legally, it's on the radio, it's on TV, people are selling records, and then suddenly you got to be like, oh, we got to pay people for these samples.
Right.
Like, there was a wild west of the 80s into the 90s of like who's paying for what. It was a mess.
Right.
It still continues to this day, like trying to clear samples of hip hop stuff, like behind the scenes, nightmare. But he gets to retains ownership of all those things. One of the songs that gets sampled heavily is his interpretation of Paul Simon's "Take Me to the Mardi Gras." It's a really cool cover, and he does a lot of covers. He does classical covers, he does folk and pop covers, but that was one, because it's an instrumental version of a really catchy song that just stuck. And so for that, Paul Simon gets the publishing money because he wrote it, but Bob still gets the money from the performance. So all of a sudden, he gets thrown into something that he never expected to have happen.
No,
he asks
you don't
for
anticipate
payment.
that for
yeah,
sure.
Exactly. He asks for payment, but like wholly embraces it. I mean, this is a guy who loves expression. He loves improv, and he's looking at these artists and he's just like, cool, you're doing what I was doing with Sonny Rollins albums. Like, I'm just playing them myself. Like, I'm covering things,
Right.
and I'm doing licks, and I've got little pieces that I'm shouting out to him or whatever in my songs, but like, you're just doing it in a different way. It's
Right.
my recording, so pay me. But like, it's the same kind of.
Totally. I mean, I can definitely attest to that as a musician. That there are certain things that you've listened to over the years that when you're then expressing yourself with whatever your instrument of choice may be, it comes out, even if it's just completely subconscious and unintentional. It's inevitable.
Yeah, everything's built upon something else. Yeah. So then we get to the 90s. 90s get weird, like I said. Smooth jazz smooth jazz like takes things over. Smooth jazz has a meltdown ultimately then. He has this great album called Grand Piano Canyon, which I did discover. I don't have it on vinyl. I had it on CD. But I did discover it back in the day, and I thought it felt like the early Bob James stuff, which again, I was all discovering it in real time, but we're talking a 25-year career at that point. So it should be getting kind of stale, and it felt really great. And the players on the 90 album wind up becoming Foreplay, this super group that he still plays with to this day. The guitar players have rotated out. One of them passed a couple years ago. He's had a couple guitar players go in and out of the band, but always him on keys, and same bass and drummer. It's Nathan East on bass and Harvey Mason on drums.
So that Grand Piano Canyon album from 1990. So
exactly, that was like, that was kind of like the end, I guess, of his sort of solo work. It was almost like a punctuation point. Although I guess that's wrong, because he puts out Espresso not that long ago. I feel like maybe it was like 10 years ago, and that was really good. And it was either him or Bob James Trio. It's tough to. It's weird. Like, I can only say what it feels like. I'd have to look on my shelf and see what it's actually framed as. But like, I can tell the difference between, for me, like a Foreplay album and this. Like, this feels like a Bob James album, and this feels like a Foreplay album. And I think the dynamic shifts, like who's taking solos and stuff. Like,
right.
it's a little it's a little all over the place. So that album then becomes Foreplay. They go on to get nominated for a bunch of Grammys. And yeah, he still performs to this day. The guy just cranks out tunes. He still tours. He's 83, 82, 83. And I haven't seen him live, dude. Like,
Man. Yeah,
I'm kicking myself
that,
every
think.
time. I know. Yeah. So like, I got to figure it out. He was playing in DC recently, and I was like, do I drive? It's 3 hours. I could do that.
Yeah,
and
that's
it just
not
didn't
bad for a
time out.
concert.
It didn't time out. So I've got
I
to
drove
figure
more than
out.
that to see Explosions in the Sky. That's
Right?
You know,
Yeah.
Granted, it was still within the same state, but that's Texas for you. Anyway, yeah, it's not too far for a concert.
Yeah. So I've been listening to him. I mean, Taxi aside, I've been listening to him as a fan for 20 something years now.
Man.
Going on 20 years now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wholly not somebody who's versed in jazz at all. So there's only so much that I can contribute to a conversation about what jazz means. But when it comes to looking at a genre and putting labels on it, I think it's tough. Smooth jazz has gotten the biggest beating since Fred Durst of like collective audience slap of like pivoting from wholly embraced to thrown out with the garbage. Now, Fred Durst is an unfair example because and look, I could be a Limp Bizkit apologist, but like it has nothing to do with this. Like he fully got what was coming to him that was never going to be anything. Like smooth jazz doesn't deserve the bashing. Yes, right. It can be. Right. It can be very cheesy. You know, it can be very corny, and you can turn it into anything. But you can do with folk.
Yeah,
you can
I was
do
just
that
gonna
with country.
Say, any genre can get real cornball real quick.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Rock has a million of them.
Lean too hard into what makes it what it is, it can just get complete cheeseball very, very fast.
Right. And so the 90s is, and again, like if you're digging through the CDs, if you're digging through the vinyl, if you're looking around and you can look at the dates on these things, the 90s is dicey, man. Like there's a lot of, like, they didn't know what was gonna stick at that point, and I think there was a lot of money being thrown around, and because radio had embraced the format so much going into the 90s, there was a race to just kind of get on the next wave because it was so big. So
that'll kill something real quick.
Like if you're looking to look for something in the quote unquote smooth jazz umbrella that feels authentic and has something that speaks to you, I wouldn't start in the 90s. I would go to the 70s and the 80s where it was being birthed. And it all comes down to fusion. Like when everything is being fused together in different ways, but rather than trying to fuse something and fire it off into space, like these artists are just kind of like mixing stuff together and trying to make something that is cohesive. You know, it's like they took a bunch of pieces and they made a cake. They didn't like build a freaking bomb and try to blow something up, you know?
Right. Yeah.
So I look then at today. I love yacht rock, you know? I love soft rock. Mm-hmm. It can be corny as hell. Like,
yes,
bread is bread, man. Like 10cc and Ambrosia and Toto and Firefall. Like all of these bands, you know, like you can look at them and you can roll your eyes, but also you listen to them and they got chops. Like, these guys can sing and they've got soul, and like they I don't know, they wrote some really infectious songs. And like, there's a reason why we're looking back on quote unquote soft rock now, or yacht rock, if you want to call it that, like however you want to frame that, because that, again, wasn't that dismissed as smooth jazz was, but it was tossed aside, and it was a joke for years and years and years.
Yeah.
And only now we look back at it and can appreciate it and feel it and allow ourselves to like smile at the fact that we're like grooving to some Hall and Oates a bit more, than we were admitting to. Like,
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, everybody liked Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles, but like 10cc is pretty solid, like Ambrosia records are good. Everybody likes Steely Dan. You can't not like Steely Dan. Like, it's good.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
I also think what tends to happen is that as time passes, the whatever you want to call it, through the lens of the passage of time, the cream kind of rises to the surface.
Yeah.
And so, in the thick of it, during the era when it was actually happening, there was so much that it all was just a big mass, and nothing stood out really. And then as time goes on, the artists that maybe weren't so good, maybe weren't representing the genre or whatever the case may be, the movement, whatever you want to call it, they kind of fall off.
Yeah.
In the eyes of history, and or you could call it looking back with rose tinted glasses, but it's really just a matter of when you look back on an era, you're typically looking at the best of what the era had to offer.
Yeah.
So there could be a lot of that at play as well.
Yeah, I mean, you can curate it. Right? Like you're not awash in it as much. There's been a movement in Japan that is re-celebrating or rediscovering this genre that was happening around the same time, that like 80s era of sort of jazz, R&B, funk fusion over there, and it was a blend of Western music. It was called city pop, and again, it was like there's a lot more vocals to it. It's not like what we're talking about here with jazz soul or soul jazz or whatever, but it was also kind of maligned. And then in the sort of vaporwave era that we've come into, that aesthetic of throwback, like, this is cool again, right? There's a new appreciation to it where we don't have the stigma that was associated culturally to like, oh, this is Martha and she's 55 and she sits there listening to Kiss FM, and like it's all of that's been washed away, and now it's been given a new aesthetic, which is also potentially problematic. Just like the yacht, like I feel for Christopher Cross, man. Like, he doesn't want to be yacht rock, and everybody's just decided that that's what he is. And like, people appreciate it now, and I don't think that it's like a joke, I don't think that it's done in a sarcastic kind of way. I think people like to rally around a new aesthetic because it's an easy way to feel accepted, but there's a deep appreciation underneath yacht rock for soft rock, and there's a deep appreciation underneath vaporwave for this city pop aesthetic. And I look at lo-fi, which is like the thing now, right? And all that I hear with lo-fi is the hip hop beats that were then kind of birthed from this era of soul jazz and smooth jazz that is then being applied to motifs that we're familiar with. in a palatable, easy to listen to way. When you and I are, and when we're in Discord and we're talking about these lo-fi video game covers or interpretations of this or that, like, we like that stuff because we can put it on and do other things and feel engaged but not overstimulated. Lo-fi feels good, right? Like, lo-fi stuff right now just scratches that itch. And I'm looking back at these records that I have here, and I'm like, this is what I felt about this all along, is I can throw these things on and it's not, cheese, but it's also not blowing my mind. Like, it's just feels good and smart and well put together, but digestible, And like, again, the Weather Channel thing was very funny. Like, that was so you made this offhanded comment, and I was like, that is so perfect to what you would think of as smooth jazz, because that's what it is. And it's like the echo effect of what happened there, right? Where it was like, it is fully palatable and they need something to put on there. I think about like video game menus, like the Wii menu music and the Wii shop music, which is like pretty jazzy. Like, there's all this commercially palatable versions of what we're talking about here that have been taken from it, but they don't necessarily reflect back on the source material, I guess is my point.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
Yeah.
That's solid.
So I think I'm in many ways a smooth jazz apologist. I think that I'm not suggesting you go out and take your mom's Kenny G CDs. I don't think that you need to get immersed in it all, but I think if you can appreciate it and approach it like you do any other cool, like, I hate calling it background music, but because it's more than that. But so is the stuff that we call background music anyway. So
right, I mean, you talked about the lo-fi beats.
Yeah,
it's something that you can actively listen to and enjoy,
right.
But also, and there's a reason why, there's Twitch channels that just stream an endless playlist of this stuff. It has the tendency to help you focus, and there's a reason why there's the whole lo-fi girl thing where she's just sitting there studying, and it kind of helps you focus, it helps you study. And I don't know exactly what it is about it that causes that reaction in people, where it allows them to, maybe it's something to do with the slower, usually no vocals going on, instrumental, but not, wildly improvisational. That just kind of, there's something almost Zen-like about it. And I hate to even go there with it, but there is something about it. It's just very well balanced, very calm, and very trying very hard not to use the word smooth is what I'm doing.
Yeah. No, it is. It almost just like you get this little sub buzz in your brain where it's like you've kind of taken, it's not your lizard brain, but some kind of area in that space, and you can distract it enough there where you're not.
It's satisfying.
You
feel safe.
You feel good, and then you can assign the rest of your brain to do other stuff that needs to be done.
There it is.
But and again, this could just be my own relationship with it because of my experiences. It could also be the Kenny G effect that like messes with my head. I still have problems with like and there's some fantastic saxophone players. I mean, like David Sanborn and Kirk Whalum. Like, there's all of these awesome players, and there's these great sax moments in these songs that Bob does. But it's the keys, man. It's like the electric. It's the Rhodes sound of those keys is so smooth. Like it doesn't distract like even a guitar does. Earl Klug is a great acoustic guitarist in this space, and I find that the tonality of the acoustic guitar in a lot of these records has a similar effect where it kind of lets me, I don't know, it kind of puts me in that space. Nothing against some of the sax stuff. I mean, like, again, Grover Washington Jr. is a fantastic sax player, and you can put on his albums and go. It's just the sax tends to immediately bring a little bit more funk to it, like a little bit more. It's a little bit more of a voice in some ways than the piano, than the keys are even.
It's a lot more expressive.
Yeah, and so like I'd start with the keys and the guitar centric stuff first, and then maybe dabble in the sax stuff. Again, I feel like there's a stigma about because when I say the word smooth jazz, not just Kenny G, but you just see a guy swinging around playing a saxophone. Like that's the stereotype of smooth jazz. So I feel like the saxophone also just has a bad rap in general in all of this, which is unfair. But yeah, if you're looking for something, if you're into lo-fi or you're looking just for something in the background, I mean, we were talking about throwing on albums around the holidays. Obviously there's great Christmas music to throw on, but this is also so palatable. I mean, I put them on, again, it's my kid's been exposed to it just because she's my kid, but like,
right.
I throw it on and she'll just like kind of bop around the house. Like, she's not, I'm watching her, right? And she's not distracted by it. Like, she doesn't want to listen to jazz. Right. If I put on a Herbie Hancock album, she doesn't want to hear it,
Yeah, because it commands attention.
It does, but like I throw on one of Bob's albums and she's playing with her toys or she's writing something down or whatever, and she's tapping her foot and she's moving around and she's got a little swagger as she walks to her room to get something, and I'm like, this kid is got that mid-level and is operating on top of it all. It just feels good. So I'll put together a fun little playlist just for reference for everybody. But again, this subject is so much more than this one guy. He's my experience. He's who I would suggest is the gateway drug for this space, because he will inherently lead you. He's done collabs with everybody else you need to know in this space. And the music that you're going to find by him is going to be in that 70s and 80s sweet spot of it's exactly what you're going to be looking for. So I can't suggest it enough. Unsung hero of pop music, I think, even in general, and the impact that he's had across multiple genres. And yeah, I have to see him live. Like, I can't. I'm gonna lose my mind if I don't figure this out, because I will have spent 20 years just putting it off and not making the time to do it. I know, yeah. So that's my take on smooth jazz for what it's worth. Yeah.
I think what I'm most excited about is to go down the hip hop sample rabbit trail.
Oh yeah.
And follow, like, okay, this song sampled this Bob James song, and then like listen to both of those, and then okay, what else did this artist sample? What are some other Bob James songs that have been sampled probably numerous times? And just kind of, that sounds to me like a really fun way to explore it. Because it's kind of hard with him having so many albums. I mentioned briefly at the beginning that I kind of just picked 3 because I figured, you know, the 70s albums would, number one, be a little bit less, you know, quote unquote Weather Channel.
Exactly.
But it really did just kind of call out to me because of the album artwork. And the other one that, and I tried to listen to some other albums, and they were way too, you know, I don't even know what the term is. It's just that
Smooth.
It comes in with like the chimes.
Yeah.
And
it feels corny. It definitely feels corny.
Right. It feels like an Amy Grant song is about to start or something. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like, or the intro to like an 80s soap opera that my mom used to watch or something along those lines. And something about it doesn't, my brain doesn't love it for whatever reason. But then moving on past that, later on in the future, there were some that really stuck out to me. This album that he did with Keiko Matsui, the Altair Vega. And it's literally just piano duets. 2
pianos, right? Yeah.
And it's amazing.
Gorgeous. Yeah, I mean, he's put out classical albums too. Yeah, he's yeah.
And that surprised me.
He's super versatile.
It's really, really cool, really interesting. Yeah. And whenever you have like 2 really creative jazz minds playing the same instrument, it's always really, really interesting to me. It almost kind of reminds me of, there was this album that Billy Martin did, and he's probably best known as the drummer for Medeski, Martin and Wood.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
The kind of more modern jazz trio, organ jazz. And he did like a jazz album with another drummer, and it's all percussion. And
I don't even know what that would sound like.
It's wild. I'll say this. It's a lot more interesting than you would think it would be.
Yeah.
For an album with basically just 2 drummers.
But I'm assuming that that's something that is like, it's pretty experimental. Like to go into that space, you got to kind of go into it and pay attention to it, right?
A little bit, but it's just more so like hearing these 2 virtuosos playing off of each other.
Okay.
Like at their peak of their ability, and bouncing back and forth and kind of riffing off of what the other one is doing. And so it's like listening in on a conversation between 2 geniuses. You know what I mean? It's very, very cool.
Is this the G. Calvin Weston? Is that what it is? No, who is it? Who's it with?
See,
it's called
so
Percussion Duets.
That
if
name
it's called
sounds
Percussion
very
Duets,
familiar.
Yeah. All right, I got to look into this. That sounds cool.
It's just it's interesting that it reminded me of that.
Yeah.
And it just comes down to the way that, you know, the mind of a jazz musician seems to work. I don't profess to know from any personal experience or anything, but it's just conversational is a good word. It's a give and take and playing off of each other with whatever the instrument may be. Yeah. And there is that in, you know, a jazz band where, you know, everyone's playing their own distinct different instrument. Yeah. And I think that might be one of the defining tenets of jazz and what makes it jazz to begin with. But this does kind of see, I never would have listened to the Taxi theme song or the music from it and like called it jazz.
Right?
Even though it totally is.
It is. Yeah, but it like, and it is kind of smooth jazz. Like it's I mean, for me, and again, I don't have the correct terminology, but it feels like I keep coming back to just city jazz. Like it just, because I again, there's the Japanese city pop genre, which isn't that far removed from this, and it just feels like city jazz. And if I'm looking at yacht rock, I'm like, well, I don't know if they want to be called city jazz. I don't know if that's a thing already. I'd have to look it up. But like this kind of like
makes sense.
Funk R&B fusion with like a softer kind of jazz aesthetic. It just it's got the momentum to it. That's where my head has gone to it. And again, it sticks with the fact that the cover that he did of "Take Me to the Mardi Gras" is sampled in "Straight Outta Compton" by N.W.A., "Hold It Now, Hit It" Beastie Boys, "Dig a Hole" by Jay-Z, like Nas, Peter Piper by Run DMC. Like they all pulled from this one iteration that he did of this Paul Simon song. So it's cool, like you were saying, it's cool to go back and hear the sort of original version, and then you can go and hear like, okay, NWA and Beastie Boys used the drum. They like pulled the drum portion of that and used that as their loop, and Run DMC used the key part or whatever, you know, like, yeah, it's pretty neat to kind of dismantle something and see the pieces for what they are and be able to like, it's like when you have a reference point for like a flavor and then you like eat something, you're like, oh, it kind of tastes like cherries, you know? Like, yeah, you can be like, oh yeah, I can see that now. Like I hear something in there that I didn't know was there before. So
Completely. And it is interesting that for some reason going down that like hip hop sample rabbit trail seems less daunting than just taking the full brunt of the discography and trying to digest that.
Yeah.
But I definitely can see getting into this as, you know, it's starting to get colder, starting to do a lot more activities and things inside, rather than, you know, going out and about, and, you know, putting on some of this instrumental stuff that is less distracting. And you're right. A lot of it, and it doesn't surprise me that they call it city jazz, because it, for some reason, whether it's just that Fender Rhodes electric piano sound, and to another, you know, certain extent, the vibraphone, there is just
rhythm,
something very urban about it.
Yep.
Sonically, and I don't even know why. I can't really. And I don't know. It feels like I don't know. It feels like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Sesame Street, watching movies based in New York in the late 70s, early 80s. You know,
well, we were joking
TV
about
sitcoms
Grease.
like Taxi, like it all kind of blends together into this wonderful, like kind of dusty, kind of like winter in New York, but kind of safe feeling at the same time. It feels very cozy. Yeah, it's all
just try throwing it on when you're cleaning the house next. That's all. Like just you're washing the dishes, you're cleaning the house. It gives you exactly what you're describing right now. It can kind of take you to that place without making you feel like you needed to buy a ticket. You know, like you didn't need to actually invest any effort into it. It just kind of takes you there.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like that Christmas tree smell where it's just like, oh yeah, I can smell the Christmas tree if I notice it, but it's there no matter what, right? Like this is like, you can put it on and you can pay attention to how amazing of a key player he is, and as an arranger as he is, and how tight that rhythm section is. But you could also just not pay attention to it and just let the Christmas tree smell make you feel good, and the music make you feel good. Yeah,
just let it permeate. It's
That's
just
right.
It's just part of the atmosphere.
Yeah. And I'll say
Love
one
it.
last thing, like the lo-fi thing. So I have gone on, I have to stop myself because Bandcamp is such a slippery slope, man. Like
It really
Bandcamp
is.
has my credit card and I'm paying the artists directly. And so I like feel very good
Yes,
about
it feels
right?
good.
Like I love fueling and supporting these artists that are making this. And I love the lo-fi thing. But there's a part of it that I feel like I am consuming candy in that space too much, where I'm going to things that have motifs that I'm familiar with. I'm going to the video game stuff and the covers and things, and I'm like, I should be a little more adventurous and branch out and just listen to people who are doing their own original compositions in this space, because that is what we're talking about here. Like all of these artists were covering, classic songs and doing their interpretations of all these different songs. So it's not that different. But the things that I wind up appreciating in this space, this city jazz space, we'll call it, like, is the original compositions. And so I'm looking at lo-fi and I'm like, maybe I should be delving into there a little bit more. Like I keep going back to Legend of Zelda covers, and that's probably not
Video
that's probably
game
not
music
the
is a
thing.
very easy gateway drug
It
to
is
get into that.
Yeah.
I'll tell you one thing that is a very easy way that I found to like discover lo-fi artists that you really dig and connect with. There is a Twitch channel called Chill Hop Music,
Okay.
and
Chill
it runs, as far as I know, anytime that I've ever gone and looked it up to put it on to play, whether I'm working or doing stuff around the house, folding laundry, that kind of mundane stuff, it's always there. So I think it just runs and like on an endless loop.
Okay.
But I don't feel like I've ever heard the same song twice. And some of it's okay, some of it's great, and there's a lot in
Right.
between. But if something really, really reaches out and I'm like, oh, this is really good, it has the name of the artist and the song and the album
Okay.
right there.
All
And
right.
then you can, go and look that up on whatever your streaming service of choice is, and it's usually there. So that's been a great resource that I don't even remember how I found it, but it's there, like perpetually playing this chill hop or lo-fi playlist. But yeah, it's chill hop music on Twitch. And I know there's probably a dozen or more other resources that do similar things, but that's the one
Yeah.
that I found that I tend to, there's never,
toss on.
I'm like, there's never like, oh, I wish I could skip this track. Like it's always
Yeah.
consistently very good.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like, I mean, if I don't have a sitcom that's going to get me fully immersed into it, then a Twitch channel is probably the 2022 equivalent of that. Like
Gotta
I
be.
streamed it on Twitch and I got connected, and
Yeah.
now I need to find my lo-fi Bob James. That's what I got to do.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, this is awesome.
Cool. Thanks for
I-
indulging me. I know this was a weird one.
No, well, honestly, wasn't even that weird. It was just interesting and, maybe slightly off the beaten path from what we normally do, but
Yeah.
we got to branch out at some point, expand our minds a little bit, right? And
I mean, I figured I'd take the opportunity. When else are we going to
Perfect.
talk about it? Yeah.
there we go. And so, I'm excited to see what else we can get into and, expand our minds on in the future. Because these last couple episodes are fantastic. And
Yeah.
I've had a lot of fun talking with you both in both directions, both as the the sensei and as the student. Just like, it's been really, really awesome. And thank you for expanding my mind on Bob James. And thank you, listener, for listening to Retro Groove. We are part of the Retro Logic family of podcasts. You can find us on Discord on the Retro Logic server. You can also find us on Twitter at retrogroove_pod. And until next time, adios.